Vampires have been a topic of folklore since the 18th century, and they became the subject of several novels during the 19th century. The most well-known of these, but not the first, was Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897. Over 100 years later, Dracula has been in more films than any other literary character. So today, I'm going to have a nice glass of blood and talk about the history of Dracula in film. Welcome to my Meltdown. I'm not going to overly review each film, but I do want to point out a few highlights, changes from the original story, and stuff I just found amusing about each of these. Also, because there are hundreds of movies with Dracula in them, ranging drastically in quality and in fidelity to the source, I'm going to mostly stick with movies that are actually trying to adapt the novel. Vampires in films started almost immediately in the silent film era. The first few of these are unsurprisingly adaptations of Dracula. A lot of them are considered lost films now with no surviving prints. The first that we do have prints of, thankfully, is 1922's silent classic Nosferatu. But we almost didn't have that. The company that made it, Prana Film, implicitly adapted Dracula for the screen, knowing they didn't have the rights. They changed the character names, like Dracula was changed to Count Orlok, mixed up a few things, but the lift was pretty blatant. Bram Stoker's widow sued them, and Prana promptly declared bankruptcy to avoid paying the estate. All copies of the film were ordered destroyed, but a copy got out and it gained a following. Nosferatu is creepy, and it definitely doesn't fit the modern sexy sensibility of vampires that we have now, with its clawed, bald, ghastly antagonist, but it's iconic enough that almost a full century later it's still a part of pop culture. There was a movie made about the making of this movie, Shadow of the Vampire, but it posited that the actor who played Count Orlok was a real vampire, played in this movie by Willem Dafoe. 1931 saw the release of the first approved Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi, and this also became an icon. To this day, the image in a fair number of people's heads when you say Dracula, or even vampire, is a pale, charismatic, well-dressed, dark-haired man with a widow's peak, a cape, and a thick Eastern European accent. It's such a striking image that they based a Muppet on it.
But sometimes I get carried away.
There's a scene in the 1931 Dracula where he has pet armadillos crawling around in his castle in Transylvania, which takes me out of the movie every time I see it because armadillos are solely native to the Americas and wouldn't have been in Transylvania. However, armadillos are also one of a small handful of species that can catch or transmit leprosy between themselves and humans, which happened after Europeans spread leprosy to the Americas. So all I'm saying is Dracula gave leprosy to armadillos.
We've got, armadillos in our trousers.
The Universal film cuts and switches around some characters, though keeping names from the novel, unlike Nosferatu. Really, most of the films do this switching around to some degree, sometimes combining Harker with Renfield, sometimes they take Renfield out completely, sometimes they kill Jonathan Harker off in Transylvania. They swap Lucy and Mina or mash them up into one person, remove other characters entirely. One weird thing, the 1931 Dracula and the 1932 Universal film The Mummy have basically the same plot and structure.
Thought we wouldn't notice, but we did.
It sort of makes sense as the cinematographer on Dracula, and by some accounts the shadow director of this film, Karl Freund, was the director of The Mummy, and that's a link I will put a pin in for later. There were two direct sequels, though, as with many of these 1930s monster movies, none of the main cast returned. Lugosi said after Dracula that he was done with this character, and his greatest fear was to be typecast as this. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened, and even when he wasn't playing a vampire, almost everything he was offered were horror flicks. He played Dracula one more time in the 1948 comedy Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and played a vampire 3 more times in Mark of the Vampire, The Return of the Vampire, and Mother Riley Meets the Vampire. In 1958, Hammer began releasing a series of Dracula films starring Christopher Lee. Lee plays Dracula in a very different way. He's a bit more regal, I would say. Lugosi had charisma, but also spends about half his screen time creepily staring at people, though to be fair, he was really good at that. Anyway, this film returns to the novel's roots in a sense, the story being told via diary entries. Only one of Dracula's brides appears in this movie, and she begs Harker to help her escape before Dracula has even appeared in the film. Then Dracula shows up, she abruptly runs off, and Harker talks to Dracula as if a woman didn't just tell him that she was being kept prisoner here by his new boss against her will. He's just like, that was weird, oh well, back to work. Except no. Harker in this version is onto him the whole time and came here to kill Dracula, which I think is unique to this telling. Usually he's clueless to the danger when he arrives. Most versions of the film have a transfusion scene where they give either Lucy or Mina, depending on which version they've done, blood. In this version, Arthur finishes giving blood to Lucy, and the doctor says to him something about, go have something to drink, preferably wine. And honestly, it just made me giggle a little, but considering the time frame, I'm surprised he didn't say something like, okay, the transfusion is done, go have some cocaine now so you don't get all woozy. Christopher Lee is really great in this. He's menacing and creepy, but composed for the most part until he loses it. He went on to play the role several more times in sequels and a few films unrelated to Hammer, including a comedy that he later insisted wasn't filmed as a Dracula movie, and they switched the title after he completed filming, and he was not happy about it. Like Lugosi, he had feared typecasting, and for a time he was, but he overcame that, holding the Guinness record for the most screen credits as an actor in 2007, as well as having the record for the most film roles in which he engages in a sword fight, which is an interesting record. As a side note, this stuff barely scratches the surface of the incredible, interesting life of Christopher Lee. He hunted Nazi war criminals in real life. He spoke like 8 languages, and he was descended from frigging Charlemagne. Now, before doing this video, I'd heard of the Dan Curtis Dracula from '73 starring Jack Palance, but I'd never seen it. And I wanted to watch or rewatch a bunch of these to have it all fresh in my head. So I did. This was made for TV. It has a lot of dramatic extreme close-ups. A lot. So many. Like, nearly every scene, start to finish, has some kind of, like,
Extreme close-up! Wah! Wah!
interesting side bit. When it was initially scheduled for its TV premiere, this version was preempted for a special news report about the resignation of Spiro Agnew and broadcast 3 months later than its originally planned air date. Dan Curtis was also the creator of the vampire TV series Dark Shadows from the late 60s. He was attempting to revive the series in 1991, but it was canceled due to low ratings that are partially attributed to the show being frequently preempted by news coverage of the Persian Gulf War. This poor guy just couldn't catch a break trying to make vampire television without the real world messing it up. This Dracula is awkward, like he keeps interrupting Harker mid-sentence and just sure is in a rush for an immortal being. I said earlier I was putting a pin in the Mummy. Well, this movie is the first of the adaptations to feature the obsession with Mina/Lucy being a possible reincarnation of his previous lover, which in itself is one plot point from the 32 Mummy that wasn't just lifted from Dracula. Like, they just stole it right back from them, which is fair. It's also the first movie to bring up Vlad the Impaler as a vague origin of Dracula. The connection had been discussed in literary circles before, but never actually addressed in film. The sound effect when Van Helsing finally impales Dracula is one of the funniest splorch noises I've ever heard in my life. Inexplicably, this movie ends after Dracula dies with a text crawl giving a brief history of Vlad the Impaler, which seems superfluous at this point because the movie is over. On to 1975's Dracula with Frank Langella. Sometimes it's called Dracula: A Love Story. John Williams did the score for this, and it feels like this was in places like a first draft of some of his Raiders of the Lost Ark score. It's not bad, it's just not as iconic as a lot of his other work. This movie starts on the boat already, skipping Transylvania entirely, and ends on a boat, having never been to Transylvania for any scene, which was a choice. Dracula here is played much more charming to begin with, less awkward, really playing up his allure for women. Most Draculas are just in it for the blood, but I think Frank Langella's Dracula genuinely is like, I mean, since I'm here already, let's bone first. Anyway, the scene where Mina dies. I'm not a doctor, but I don't think it's a very sound medical practice when a woman can't breathe to just grab her face, yell at her to breathe, and then slap her repeatedly while continuing to tell her to breathe. And, surprise, it doesn't help her breathe and Mina is dead now. Between this and Halloween, I'm starting to think Donald Pleasance is not a good doctor. So, after Mina is buried, Dracula rides up on a horse to the graveyard to pay respects. Yep, I'm just gonna ride this horse right into the graveyard like a totally normal person. Also, the horse is afraid of the cross tombstone and starts panicking like, is the horse a vampire too? A vamp horse, horsepire, equus ferratu? I don't know. Then Van Helsing and Dr. Seward use a second horse to detect vampires in the graveyard, like it's a drug-sniffing dog, but a horse, and it can only detect the undead. It's they were meant to think both horses are just detecting the presence of a vampire, but one of them is being ridden by Count Dracula, and he's fine up until he's in the graveyard. Maybe the horse is just not good with funerals, because same horse. The big battle with Dracula in this takes place on a ship going back to Romania. Dracula gets impaled on a hook by Van Helsing and hoisted up into the daylight, where he screams a bunch and then apparently dies. But then the body slips off the hook and flies off into the distance while they have a close-up of Lucy smiling, leaving us with probably the only ambiguous Dracula ending. So in 1992, Francis Ford Coppola made Bram Stoker's Dracula. This one returns to the Vlad the Impaler plot point, as well as the reincarnated lover, but then adds to it in the prologue. The idea that to become a vampire, all you have to do is renounce God, stab a giant stone cross with a sword, which will then bleed, obviously, and then let the blood drip into a chalice, which you then drink, is completely bonkers, oddly specific, and yet somehow just kind of works for this movie anyway. Gary Oldman sells the most absurd Dracula origin I can imagine. Man, he must have nicked one of that stone cross's arteries. I know everyone mocks Keanu Reeves' English accent in this movie, and they are right to do so. I can't fathom the idea that they started filming for this, heard that accent, and just went, yeah, this is good. But I have to say, it could have been so much worse if you think about it. Can you imagine if he'd gone full Dick Van Dyke and Mary Poppins, just full over-the-top Cockney? And yet somehow I think that wouldn't have seemed out of place in this movie. That just goes for it in every way it can except this. Really, I think part of what makes people point out how bad this accent is that it's the least over-the-top thing in the entire movie, which makes it stand out even more, because it's the only thing in this entire movie I can describe as understated. Who does Dracula's hair? I think this is the only film version I've seen that includes the Quincy character from the novel. Imagine if Dracula hadn't gotten younger over the course of the movie and it was just this weird, old, creepy, rich dude with the weirdest hair you've ever seen, and he's hitting on this young woman as if it's totally normal. See? Creepy. Anthony Hopkins as Van Helsing in this is definitely the most eccentric version of that character I've seen portrayed. Dracula suddenly turning into dozens of rats to escape is one of my favorite things in this movie, because it's something I wish I could do sometimes to avoid people. I do have to say, as much as there are things I do like about this version, giving Dracula a redemption arc is certainly a choice. I have a lot of respect for this version. It gets a lot right that no other film adaptation has. Oldman and Hopkins are both a lot of fun to watch, and I love how they did the visual effects as practically as possible because Coppola didn't want to use CGI. I appreciate the commitment to old school filmmaking, but I still don't like this weird sympathy arc for Dracula. Next was 1995's Mel Brooks satire Dracula, Dead and Loving It. And I love Mel Brooks and I love Leslie Nielsen, but this is not their best work. I'm just going to close my eyes now and think about Young Frankenstein.
That's Frankenstein.
One of the weirder Dracula-adjacent things I've seen was Blade Trinity, in which they make it a plot point that the main bad guy, who they call Drake throughout the film, used to be Dracula, but he's not like any other version of Dracula, and they don't really do anything with that plot thread. It just kind of feels like Dracula's public domain, so why not? This all comes to the big question, which is the best Dracula? And honestly, from Nosferatu on, a lot of them bring something to it that the others don't, so I can't pick one. But it's not the Jack Palance one, that's for sure. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have a favorite or least favorite Dracula, let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you want more of my rambling, and as always, thanks for coming to my Meltdown.